All right. We are live. We're going to be starting soon. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I wanted to take a minute at the beginning of this panel. The verdict in the Rittenhouse trial has just been announced. If you have not seen the news, he was found not guilty on all charges. This is an obvious reflection of white supremacy in our legal system, and we want to take a moment to note that this has happened and acknowledge that this is a rough time for many of our panelists and attendees. We'll also be talking more later about how the criminal justice system perpetuates societal racism and how that impacts community living. With that, I'll turn it over to Noor, the moderator of our panel.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Haley. And then, okay, it looks like we do have attendees coming in. Great. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming to our panel on racial disparities in community living. My name is Noor. I'm the Community Engagement Manager for the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. For anyone who is just getting here that needs captions, there should be a button on desktop that says CC for closed captions. And for anyone on mobile, you're going to click the 3 dots in the bottom right menu and click View Transcript in order to see that. So thank you so much for coming, and thank you to all of our panelists for coming and joining this conversation with us. For our introductory question, we just wanted to go around and do just kind of basic introductions for the folks who are speaking today. So please go ahead and provide your name, pronouns, if you use them, what your relationship is to this subject matter. And let's go ahead and start with Sina.
Did you say Lucina?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, I'm Lucina Kai. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am the executive director of Atlas of Blackness, a multimedia artistic research organization for Black foster youth. And I feel like I missed the other part. I'm slightly my brain's all over the place right now.
Oh, you're completely fine. That was all the info.
Okay.
All right, awesome. And then next up, let's go ahead and go to Valerie Novak. Just as a heads up, you're on mute.
Can you hear me? Okay, I think I'm.
There you go. Yeah, now you're coming through.
I apologize so much. My name is Valerie Novak, and I just want to throw out, I am unexpectedly traveling when I wasn't planning to be, so I am sorry I'm only here by voice today, and I guess that you guys can't all look at my face, I guess. I am a disability policy researcher. I focus on inclusive built environments. I am also an Afro-Latin person. She, her pronouns are fine, and again, glad to be here with you all.
Excellent, thank you so much. And then we can go ahead and pass it to Galila.
Thank you. Yes, I am Galila Selassie. My pronouns are she, her. I am a staff attorney at Justice and Aging, which is a national nonprofit organization that does technical assistance and policy advocacy and some litigation to help older adults and people with disabilities have access to basic supports with a particular big focus on access for historically marginalized older adults and people with disabilities. So that's people at the intersection of disability, age, and things like race and LGBTQ identities, immigrants, women, other marginalized groups like that. And then I'll also add that I am a Black woman. I'm the daughter of immigrants. I myself have multiple sclerosis, so while I don't consider myself disabled, I do empathize a little bit more than I probably would have prior to my diagnosis with a lot of the challenges that people with a disability in the disability community experience. And I'll add a quick disclaimer that I have a head cold on the same day that the piece of legislation I've been working on exhaustively for 6 months, Build Back Better, was passed, and then the Rittenhouse verdict this afternoon. So I'm a little bit more scatterbrained than I normally would be. So if there's any part where I'm not making myself very clear or you'd like me to follow up, you're more than welcome to email me, and I can put my email in the chat if you'd like me to follow up on anything.
Excellent. Thank you so much. All right. So to start us off, something that you've all touched on, I apologize, my question just moved. So to start us off, so what are some aspects of community living that are essential, but that people might think of when they hear the phrase community living? For example, utilities, internet access, transportation, and healthcare are all parts of being able to fully participate in our communities. Another way to put this question is, what disparities are kind of there in terms of those resources in order to access these aspects of community living for people of color? And whoever wants to go first can, or if people would prefer that I call on them, I'm happy to do so.
I don't, or Valerie, if you'd like to start, you're welcome to. I wanted to spare you a little bit given the tech issues.
Yeah, sorry, I'm seeing street lights, so I figure I probably have a strong connection right now. This is Valerie. So I think, Nora, you listed kind of a few things in the examples. One of the things I think we often don't, there's a lot of things about community living that I think we often don't realize are attached to planning decisions and policy. So like the thing that comes to my mind, for example, is safety. Particularly for people who live in disabled bodies, in marginalized situations. And I think about things like, you mentioned utilities, a specific one that is being talked about a little bit more because of COVID, because of the infrastructure bills, are things like internet access, which a lot of people, I think, kind of took for granted until COVID and everything went online. And then suddenly people realized, oh, there are a lot of things people do online and a lot of people who don't have functioning internet. But I want to go back to the safety thing because of the group of neurodivergent people that are part of this conversation. And I remember one of the first things that I learned far before I went to school to learn about this stuff was my dad was unsheltered and was living in parks for a good part of a portion of my childhood. And I remember asking once about one of his friends that we had met and why he didn't have a home. And my dad explained to me that he talked to his shoes. And this was something that made people very uncomfortable. And because of something as simple as this guy who talked to his shoes, he had spent years and years of his life without safety or without a home, and was constantly harassed by police, was, exposed to weather and unsafe things, simply because people could call the cops and say, well, I feel uncomfortable because this guy is talking to his shoes. And so to kind of bring that to more recent, I think sometimes we think about inclusive communities and we think about some of the big things, right? We think people need housing, they need food, they need medical support. But a lot of people also need like safety in existing within their communities, and not just a shelter to live within their communities or a doctor to visit in their communities. And I think sometimes we forget about that aspect of community living, is that as part of that is actually being included and welcomed into your community, and part of that is a safety issue. And so I think sometimes some of those access things come down to things like, do the responders in your neighborhood know who you are? Do your neighbors accept you as you are? Do the local businesses, are they aware when you come in and go shopping that maybe you might be a person that takes a little bit of time to pay for your order at the end of the day? And some of those things cross the line between just making a place where somebody can live within their community to being a part of their community. And so often we don't make sure both of those things are happening. I think we're getting a little bit more conversation on the hard and fast stuff, even if we're not moving, right? Even if we're not necessarily getting all the funding for housing we need, if we're not getting all the funding for transportation we need, I at least see people talking about that. But sometimes I see less so on the stigma side. And then I'll just close with this. I recently was collecting some information about transportation and accessibility. And of course, all the things came up that you might think would come up, right? The kneeling bus will stop working, or the bus stops don't have benches, or things, the cost, all of these things you expected. But in almost every bit of data I collected, the unexpected thing was how many people did not ride transit because of the way other passengers treated them as disabled people. And that when it came down to it, one of the biggest detractors to them feeling like they were part of their community was not the physical accessibility of the bus. It was not the dents in the sidewalk. It was the way that other passengers treated them for needing access on the bus. And so sometimes I like to bring that part in, because I think a lot of people will talk about the policy side and the sort of hard infrastructure side. But more and more as I do this research, I'm finding that just as important is actual feelings of inclusion in the community, and that sometimes that is a bigger barrier than the physical, like, construction elements.
Definitely. So not just, well, I shouldn't say just, but not specifically only the infrastructure piece and the making sure that the resources are there, but also making sure that people are welcome to access them and feel that they are safe to access them without exclusion from a community that they already feel excluded from.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that makes sense. Who would like to go next?
So this is Lucinda again. I work with young people who are in foster care. So a little bit about me. I spent about 10 years of my life in the foster care system. And most of that time I was incarcerated, right? I spent most of my time incarcerated as a foster youth, that was also spent most of that time incarcerated in solitary confinement. And the interesting thing about, in regards to foster youth, is a lot of them are the invisible children within your community. A lot of there are in any given time over 400,000 young people in foster care. So we are always in your community, but are invisible to those spaces. And one of the things that I've realized over the years of being a young person and then now transitioning into, sorry, my computer is about to die, and then transitioning into this field and working with these youth is people consistently forget like a young person can have internet service, right? A young person can have access to transportation and healthcare and all these things, but that young person doesn't have a solid circle of support to make sure that those resources, they know how to actually use them and they know where those resources are located. For example, I don't know how many people know about how healthcare works for foster youth. So most foster children, even after you age out, in most states, is 20, can be until you can age out when you're 18, or you can stay in and age out at 21. In Minnesota, where I'm located, you can choose to stay until you're 21 years old. But either way, right, even if you choose to leave foster care at 18, you still get to keep your health insurance until your 26th birthday. But here's the sticky part. For a lot of foster youth, because they didn't have a solid circle of support of people from different parts of their lives that understand the healthcare, understand transportation, understand these things, a lot of foster youth go without having healthcare. And then you end up having where, like, I had this young person who didn't know that they themselves could call and continue to keep their insurance on, right? And so when they turn 18, their insurance shut off. And what usually happens is, like, when you're in Minnesota, at least, you have extended foster care social worker, and you meet with that extended foster care social worker once a month. And that social worker, when you meet with them at your county, that social worker usually has a computer in front of them. And while they're using that computer, they're usually looking to make sure your insurance is still on. But if you just choose to leave foster care, which I don't blame a lot of foster youth for doing that, because most foster children have PTSD 2 times the rate of a returning vet from Iraq, right? So I don't blame a child for wanting to leave a system that has consistently harmed them. But if you leave, right, and now you leave without any circle of support, you didn't know that once a month your social worker was actually checking to see your insurance is on. And now you're going to the hospital to get an inhaler. You get that inhaler, you get a bill for close to like $600. Where are you going to get that money from? But those are things those are like those small things that consistently happen to young people because of, even if they have access to these resources, right? You can have access to things, but if you don't actually know how to gain that access or keep that access, that ends up harming you severely. But yeah, that's one of the things that I've consistently seen in the community that I'm in, especially for Black and Native youth. And we're having a large number of young people who are ending up in foster care due to the high level of deportation of their parents in Minnesota. And that has another demeanor to why the disparities are so high with young people who are Black and brown in foster care in Minnesota.
Absolutely. That makes sense. So both making sure that people understand how to access those supports and know where to find them, and also dealing with the after effects of, like, for example, the chilling effect from the public charge ruling and from the many, many, many other pieces of legislation targeting multiply marginalized people. Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. Right. Galila?
Yeah, Lucina and Valerie said it beautifully. I don't really have too much else to add. They both hit it the nail on the head. I think one thing that I saw as a correlating theme to both, the aspects, the safety aspects to community living, as well as that the dilemma and the challenges of that invisibility of foster care youth, is this idea that community living is supposed to mean dignity. And that's really at its most basic level, is just to provide dignity to people from historically marginalized communities and with disabilities, and for older adults. And two ways that I've seen that, especially in the spaces that I work in, is something as simple as transportation, which really is not that complicated of a fix, right? What is the point of having policies that give people health care, that give people options for food or social supports or whatever, if there's no way for them to actually get to those places or get those services that we are trying to offer? And of all the dilemmas that we have to resolve in our society, all these systemic, ongoing, massive problems, accommodating vehicles is pretty much it, and just having a lot of it, right? And so just having a certified staff that's like licensed and knows how all the disability procedures, and then having people have access to them is a relatively easy fix. And it's really disappointing that we don't have that, because like anything else that we'll probably talk about today, the people who are hurting the most are the people who have been hurt the most by all these other massive disparities in our society. And then and then again, there's just that indignity there of being offered this, and then for some very small reason not being able to get it because of something as an easy fix as transportation. And then the second part I will say is on the aspects of like communication and the digital divide, which I know we've heard a lot about, or more so during the pandemic, and the idea that we have great advances in technology. That's one area that society has really advanced. And yet, again, we don't make it accessible to people. We assume that there's only one way that they can communicate with their doctors or communicate with their loved ones. And it's a very ableist and ageist thing to say, well, why don't you just do, well, you know, if you want to talk to your doctor, why don't you just get on this Zoom-like platform and do it? Not realizing all the barriers that prevent some communities from being able to do that. And again, that's a huge indignity to say, oh, this is available to you, but actually it's not. Yeah, so I think that's another big aspect of community living.
Absolutely, because trying to build something on the infrastructure that fundamentally did not consider a lot of us can lead to a lot more problems. And on the note of systemic barriers, let's kind of delving more into that. What systemic barriers are we finding are making it harder for people of color to access and to afford home and community-based services?
This is Valerie. I guess we'll just keep the order. So I was kind of hoping to jump in on that first question and connect with what my fellow panelists said. And I think it fits really perfectly into this question. Whether you're an older adult or a foster youth, or you're either of those things and also a person with a disability or not, the little ways that the big we, allow people to lose their resources and their community living over minor, like, bureaucratic paperwork is like truly mind-boggling to me, for all the reasons that have been mentioned before, that we're providing things like healthcare to try to keep youth, our young people healthy, or access to SSDI or things like that, and then make the process for that extremely difficult, oftentimes really invasive, embarrassing, sometimes harmful. I know some people who, if it wasn't literally the only way that they could survive, would do anything else but go through another disability review. Some people that are attending this might not be aware of this, but we require some people who have been born with disabilities that will never go away, that will never change, people who have had things like amputations. We are not a species that can grow our extremities back. And yet those people also regularly have to go through recertifying and proving to somebody, hey, I need help, which is really can be filled with a lot of indignity when we talk about, ableism and stigma. And so I think that is a huge barrier, and it's one that is made worse for marginalized people because of the level of time, energy, and knowledge that is often required to be able to go through a lot of these systems. If you are somebody who is already very low income, who is already hungry, who maybe has not had experience in these systems, it is extremely confusing and time sensitive to try to fill out some of these paperwork. There's doctor's appointments that are needed, which means time off work that is needed. Just the burden that is put on people with disabilities to even start the conversation of getting supports they need to stay in the community, I think might be one of the biggest barriers we have to it, because people don't even know how to start the first step of saying, hey, these are things I need to keep living in my community. And I could go on about ways I think we do that on purpose, but regardless of whether or not it is the intent of some of these, whether it's an organization or whether it's governments, of making it more difficult or not, to create systems that are meant to help people and then make it as difficult as you possibly can to access those resources, is really just by default going to make a whole lot of people unable to get the help that they need.
Absolutely. And particularly like this ongoing need to like have all of that insider information, to know that there's a certain amount of denials expected, to know that you're going to have to fight that whole system. Essentially, it's just so much work in a system where you're already being ground down to the bone constantly trying to work and survive. It's a lot. Lucinda, would you like to go next?
I feel like Valerie touched on so many aspects. Um, One of the things that I see that happens all the time, and especially with young people who, again, my experiences with foster youth and undocumented young people, is they have to be very careful of what resources they actually apply for, because then that can impact their standing with um, with this foster care. And because what is required of you as a young person who's in foster care, it's much more than somebody who is living at their parents' house and is going to school or whatever, right? And then add the fact that you're a foster child with disabilities, and certain disabilities can get you caught up more. What I mean by that is, like, if this is a younger person, right? Let's say a 15, 16, 17-year-old that may be autistic, because this happens a lot. What usually happens, a lot of foster youth hide their disabilities, even if they self-diagnose or they were diagnosed prior to ending up in care. They would physically hide those disabilities if they're able to, right? They would try to mirror some neurotypical behavior. So, like, for a lot of foster kids who are autistic, they will try to hide those type of things because they can end up in certain care facilities that are not conducive to their mental and physical health. So for a long time, you had foster youth who are autistic end up being incarcerated because of not having because of being unplaceable, right? And so when you get older and you have already had that trauma of you were considered unplaceable, you're considered like someone who shouldn't be touched, like literally the forgotten one that should be hid away. And now you're older and you can receive some of these resources. It's like this fear of, if I apply for this and I get denied, what happens to me then? Or if I apply for this and get it, do I lose any other resources that I'm getting from my county? And I think that's a huge barrier, the barrier of, like, literally fear that's been systematically placed on Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities, especially with the foster youth, that makes it where they do not want to actually get access to those resources because of fear of what could happen to the other resources that they're currently getting from the county.
That makes sense. Galila, would you like to add on to that?
Yeah, once again, excellent points by both panelists. And I think another sort of theme that I'm hearing that I thought about before, and I think you two really nailed on the head, is the idea that the bureaucracy behind always constantly having to prove that you're disabled and are you really, and that skepticism, and also that fear of saying, well, these resources are going to go away, and just sort of wanting to be put aside, and out of sight, out of mind kind of mentality for foster youth as they grow up. It just seems like we're basically trying to criminalize disability. We've talked a lot about, or maybe not as much as we should have, but as society in recent years, we've been talking about criminalizing poverty, right? With some of these laws around homelessness and with people panhandling. And I'm starting to see that it almost feels like we're doing the same thing for disability. And then when you add on communities of color who have their own sort of instinctual feelings, like your race or your identity is also a criminality, it can just feel like that, like, oh, there's something wrong here, and you're doing wrong. And I think that is a huge barrier to a lot of the services that people with disabilities need, including HCBS. I think similarly, one other pattern that I've noticed is that even when we do advance really great initiatives in the disability community, it can very often be very colorblind, which is problematic, right? And that's why we have conversations like these. I think one thing is that during the pandemic, we saw states using different Medicaid emergency authorities, and one that we saw is the Appendix K for HCBS, which is just like an amendment to the 1915C waivers that allows states to make these changes during the emergency period. A big one was allowing family members and legally responsible persons to get paid by Medicaid to serve as caregivers. And that is generally really great. Most people using HCBS would rather have a family member provide their care. They get reimbursed by the state. When you look at it a little bit closer, we're starting to notice that the users in the states that can benefit from this are the ones that can also get away with the terribly abysmal Medicaid reimbursement rates, right? So slightly better off families are more taking better advantage of this than people who will likely need to work outside of the home and make significant money outside of the home in order to provide for themselves and the person who's needing HCBS. And so while it is great, again, it's not necessarily addressing the sort of intersectional barriers that have existed for a long time. And so that's really the challenge for advocates like us, is to say, and that's not to say that we shouldn't still allow family caregivers to get paid by Medicaid, but it's recognizing that this isn't just the end all be all, right? That there's definitely more work that needs to be done if we're going to get to the root of these problems.
Definitely. And like, and one thing that I'm noticing across the board is that it feels very much like the systems that are providing these resources can also kind of feel like an inherent source of shame for disabled people of color. And it can kind of feel like they are fundamentally pushing this idea that you need to prove yourself over and over and over again to get the things that we need, which is fundamentally really, really demoralizing. And kind of, I know we've kind of talked about sort of structural barriers that exist in terms of the ways that communities approach kind of caring for each other, and the ways that like the state as an institution cares for each other, kind of treats people. So when talking about that, how do police violence, the school to prison pipeline, and mass incarceration affect who has access to community living? And I know this is kind of a heavier one, so feel free to kind of like, if folks need to like kind of take a second, or people need to skip and have us come back to them, that kind of thing, feel free to do so. Valerie, do you want to start with this one?
Sure. So the first thing I thought, listening to the conversation and kind of combining this, is the fear that a lot of people in my community had when there was the attempt to roll out the EVV, the electronic verification system. And you may or may not have the background on this, but essentially they just wanted to like really intently monitor people's home health aides and people who were receiving services by putting like essentially a monitoring system in their home. And this was terrifying to a lot of the Black and brown people in my life, in addition to like the terror that the general disability community was feeling about this, because of the additional add of being forced to invite even more surveillance into their lives. I think the reality for a lot of people, nor like you had mentioned before, that there's this kind of fear or shame in having to go for these services. But the fear part, I think, is so under discussed when we talk about the people who are supposed to be able to help us, the people that are supposed to keep us safe. I will go back to being a child and being raised with a Black dad who was often living on the streets. Just his mere existence was enough for him to get arrested and thrown into prison or thrown into jail for a night. That is the reality for so many people with disabilities, particularly people who are marginalized by race because of police. And so what that leaves you is this situation in which you are allowed to be harmed by your fellow community members, and that the people who are supposed to be able to help you from that are just as likely, if not more likely, to harm you, whether that's in a nursing home, whether that's in a jail, or interacting with the police system, whether that's interacting with Medicaid, right? And so we end up with these situations where you just have a tremendous amount of already undiagnosed or underdiagnosed people of color who then have pretty much no options to turn to because of the harm that's coming or because of the threat of harm if they do reach out. Then on the flip side of that, you end up with these conversations like we've had a lot in our community here about, oh, well, I have no idea what a Black autistic person is like. Or that's just not some, there's definitely no such thing as a Black autistic girl, right? We never see that. And part of those images that we come from are, yes, part of this diagnosis and medical racism, but it's also very much part of the way that a Black parent might unintentionally be teaching their child to mask simply because they know, hey, if my kid has fidgety hands when they get pulled over, they might get shot, right? And so it becomes this conversation of the way that you exist in your body, quite literally being something you have to reel in because it becomes a danger to your life in a way that it isn't a danger to maybe somebody else's life simply because of the way you look. It's not a difference in diagnosis. It's not a difference in treatment. It's a difference in skin color, right? That is a really heavy thing to have to walk through, trying to have self-care through, right? How do you take care of yourself and be true to yourself and live authentically in a way that doesn't harm yourself when that is criminal to other people? And I think that's the situation. We see that starting in school, and we see that with things like, what is it? Oppositional defiance disorder or what have you, right? And in like young Black boys of color, or young boys of color rather, and starting right away with saying, you don't behave the way we like you to, and instead of sending you to a doctor for that, we're going to send you to juvie, right? And kind of starting from the beginning of saying this way that you're behaving is bad, and not just bad because maybe it's disability, but bad because of the color of your skin. We're now going to label this as aggressive or defiant. And the outcomes for people who have been labeled defiant or difficult are very, very different, or can be very different from the way we treat people who are simply labeled disabled.
Absolutely. And it's definitely a fundamental example of like how these things are rooted in who the system trusts to be a quote unquote temporary problem versus a lifetime problem, and who gets labeled a problem in the first place, right? Who gets chances. And it's deeply, deeply unfair. Lucinda, would you like to take this?
Yes. So it's really interesting when we talk about like the school to prison pipeline, because one of the things I always say the school to prison pipeline is actually the foster to prison pipeline, because most children who are placed in the pipeline of the school to prison pipeline are young people who are on IEP, who are then who have IEPs, but then those young people are actually also in foster care. So they're in those dual systems, right? And if you look at, for example, California, 80% of the people who are on death row in California come directly from the foster care system. And one of the reasons why that is, right, is something that in like 1980s and 1990s, there was this expansion of the transfer laws. The transfer laws allowed for 13 different states to have like this either mandatory or have the discretion to charge young people as adults, right? If your behavior is displayed as an adult, therefore we can now transfer you to an adult facility, and you are then for the rest of your life scarred as a felon and have that adult felony tracking you. And the thing is, like, at that time it was 13 states that agreed to it, but now it's like 21. Most states have that, right? But we only have data from these 13 states. And then you look at the fact, you look at in the from like 1986 to 1991, over 828 percent of women who are being incarcerated was Black mothers, right? And those Black mothers were being incarcerated due to drug use and due to nonviolent crimes, and whatever we define as a crime, right? And you look at how our society has always criminalized people with addiction, has always criminalized things that America views as you're not being productive or productive enough to earn this citizenship. And this idea of like, in order for you to be in our society, you need to have this form of citizenship. And I don't mean a literal paper that the US government gives to you because you're an American citizen, but this idea of actual citizenship that in order for you to be considered a human in our country, we have to think that you can give us some type of labor. We have to think that you are able to produce for us in this capitalistic system. If you cannot produce for us, therefore you're useless to us. And then you look at the people who we view as being quote unquote useless are people who are consistently not only Black, Brown, and Native, but they're majority of the time have some type of disability that our society views as irredeemable, right? And so you start looking at all of these things that, like, if you are disabled and you are Black, your citizenship is revoked, right? And if you add the fact that you have any other disability, any other things that are viewed as irredeemable, which is addiction, right? Because addiction, to our white supremacist capitalistic society, if you have an addiction, you're not playing into our production. You can't produce anything for us. So therefore, you are not wanted, right? And so we're going to place you in a place where you can't get any access to resources, and now your citizenship has been revoked from this. And when I think about that and how this idea of, because our country is very much has this thing about, again, citizenship and who is viewed as a citizen, even if you are a person who may not have a disability, right? But you're Black and you're visibly Black, or if you are Native and you're a person who the society has viewed as, we don't want you here, right? We're going to find different ways to structure where you can no longer have access to resources. And then if you add the fact that you do have disability, or you have something where we, again, view that this is not productive to our society, you cannot be a working member of our capitalistic society. Therefore, we don't need you, and we're going to incarcerate you and force you to find a way to produce that. And if we can't incarcerate you, we're going to find a way to incarcerate you within your own community, which means we're going to take away resources from your community. We're going to make sure that if we can't physically take away that citizenship, we're going to make sure that the access that the society, America, gives to quote unquote citizens will be removed from you. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. Galila?
Yeah, again, very excellent points. I don't work as much as I should with incarcerated populations. We are starting to look into that a lot more. And one thing that we are noticing is just how much mass incarceration really does take years off people's lives. And when you're looking at it in the healthcare context and with access to community living, we've also seen studies that says communities of color have sometimes worse outcomes in HCBS. There's one study that showed hospitalizations were greater for Black and Brown HCBS users. They have like having reduced hours and poor services, greater risk of falls, all those measures. And you have to wonder if there is that correlation where we know all the physical and psychological stressors from mass incarceration, from decades of systemic racism, ultimately culminating, especially at the end of life. It's like the snowball effect where it's just massive and plays an even bigger role when all these systems come together. So that's the only thing I really have to say about that. But we are actually writing a paper and looking into this a bit more. And similarly, in the context of police violence, right? One awful fact about the COVID pandemic, and we've especially been looking at what's been going on in nursing homes that are disproportionately Black or Brown have had even higher COVID deaths than predominantly white nursing facilities. And then one real tragedy about all this, it's all a tragedy, but particularly heartbreaking, is that's the generation that really fought for civil rights, that saw the fire hoses and the police dogs, and then this is what we're doing to them at the end of their life, is giving them those horrible indignities during the pandemic, locking them away in nursing homes because we're not giving them access to age with dignity in their home. And so it really is a heartbreaking system, and it's something that we're just continuing to educate ourselves on.
Absolutely. And I am glad that work is ongoing. So for our second to last question, we wanted to talk about what factors are leading to communities of color and especially disabled people of color facing homelessness. And Valerie, would you like to take this one?
Yeah, I'm sorry, can you ask the question one more time?
Sure, no problem. What factors are leading to communities of color and especially disabled people of color facing homelessness?
Yeah, so I just want to make sure I'm understanding. So what factors are leading to a larger portion of people of color experiencing homelessness? Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so there are quite a few different. So we have a really, really long history of disinvestment in certain communities, in racism, in white supremacy. And so much of that is baked in and is systemic that some of these factors are not even things that people necessarily realize are happening. But right now, and especially during COVID, a lot of what we're seeing and a lot of what we a lot of the disproportion we see in some other kinds of events are things like the burden or the barrier to home ownership, for example. A lot of protections when it comes to shelter come from owning a mortgage. You have a little bit more power than you do as a renter. This is the same thing we see with like emergency situations and who gets funding for that, right? Having your housing be at the will of somebody else in a society that might already devalue your personhood because you are a person of color becomes a really, really sticky situation. And we have seen this. There have been stories time and time again that have come out of COVID and the eviction moratorium on this conversation. We also can talk about things like wage disparities and who has a living income and where jobs that pay living incomes are located. And whether or not people can live close to their work or not. But we have histories, for example, California has a place with a lot of racial zoning history. And we have whole industries there that were built up that were supposed to ideally be able to give like low wage income, but that all of the residential area that was built up around that industry was not available to people of color. And so it required things like having a car that can drive a certain distance, being able to afford gas when it's over $4 a gallon. Those are the kinds of things that then require you to get to work, to get a paycheck, to then not get evicted from your rental, right? So so much of these factors are connected in ways that people maybe don't even necessarily realize. I think the other thing that's happening a lot right now, and I forget which panelist mentioned it, but caregiving responsibilities. There are a lot of people who have either gotten COVID and now have long COVID, they're caring for somebody who got COVID or got long COVID, or they're handling and caring for themselves or family members whose disabilities or illnesses have progressed during this time and now cannot get the flexibility of work needed or the reimbursement needed to be able to bring in the income they need and take care of themselves or loved ones. So there is a lot of different factors that come down to being able to stay in your home. A lot of times, that kind of root causes is the affordability and whether that affordability comes down to being able to get paid enough or being able to purchase versus rent, or where it comes in. A lot of it, ultimately comes down to having the affordable housing available. There's also, though, we're getting into some weird other kinds of discrimination instances in housing right now that are like, for example, we talk about background checks, certain questions that are on applications. We now have a switch because it was ruled that apartments couldn't do what they were doing with security deposits. You now have a bunch of these additional like move-in fees, and it is now costing thousands of dollars to even move from one apartment to the next. These kinds of things have lasting impacts on people's ability to find housing, particularly if you're somebody who is already needing to look for housing that is more affordable.
Absolutely. Lucinda, would you like to go next?
Yeah. As usual, Valerie, the amount of knowledge you two have on this panel. Okay. So it's really interesting in Minnesota, when the uprising happened, there was a huge light put on where it needed to be put on the unhoused community that were here, because a lot of the unhoused community were people who were also organizing, not only for housing, for public housing, but organizing because of the state sanctioned murders that were happening. And a lot of them were also doing the connection of like, these state sanctioned murders are also, they're all connected to the lack of public housing that we have in Minnesota, and the large number of community members who are becoming unhoused, not only because of the pandemic, but because it's just how our system is set up across the United States, but especially in Minnesota, the land of 10,000 nonprofits, right? Everyone gets grant money to do housing work, but not actually do housing work, but just continuously perpetuating harm to the people who really need it. One of the things that we figure out because of COVID is that over 40% of people who are unhoused in Minnesota are folks who have been in foster care or are currently from the foster care system. So even though a lot of the people who are unhoused could get resources from the county and DHS and the counties weren't doing pretty much their job or a good enough job of keeping track of these young people who were becoming unhoused, or these young people who needed these resources. But then once like the county, like certain parts of the counties did find out these young people were unhoused, the options that they were given for housing, and it goes back to like the earlier conversation where both the other panelists brought up like this part of like dignity, and that even when you're offering resources, it's almost like, yeah, have pity. Like I'm gonna give you this food and you should accept it, even though if you're allergic to that food, or even though that meal I'm giving to you is not actually gonna be nourishing to you. But it's the same thing that's happening with a lot of the unhoused community in Minnesota, and I'm guessing everywhere else, where the county will offer housing like a hotel, but not caring that means that these unhoused community members are still now can't have access to other community members. Now, unlike if I move to a new apartment complex, I can invite Valerie and Meredith, whoever I want to invite into my home, because that's my choice now, because that's my space. But once we offer resources to people who we view as, it goes back to our citizens thing again, like we don't view you as a full citizen of a society. You get what we give to you, and you deal with it and get over it type thing. That a lot of unhoused folks, even when they're giving access to hotels, can't even have their community, people who they have chosen as their community, to enter their hotel room. And once they do, now you're back to being kicked out of that space, right? And so a lot of people choose to stay unhoused because there's no other options that fully sees them as humans, right? That fully sees their entire being, and only sees them as a burden to our society.
Thank you for that insight. And then Galila, would you like to add on?
Yeah, again, excellent point. I think one thing that is, there's sort of two aspects, or I guess in my mind, there's two major aspects. One is definitely those like financial factors, right? Of not being able to afford housing, of being priced out of housing more and more because of more privileged classes coming in and pricing people out of the neighborhoods they've lived in for decades. That's definitely true. And developers coming in and just almost like strip mining entire communities for, white suburban America, honestly, is what it feels like a lot of the time, at least in the neighborhood I grew up in. That was definitely the case. And it's really, really heartbreaking. I think the second element to that is that there's just this like, even if there are opportunities for affordable housing, for subsidized housing, which of course there's not nearly enough funding for, but even in the rare instances where there are, you'll see regardless, and this is an area where systemic racism isn't just limited. I'm from the Southeast, I can say very racist, very, yeah. But I think that we can't just give the like progressive, liberal, diverse states a pass here too, because even in instances where in Austin, Texas, or in New York, or in LA, or in San Francisco, where there's opportunities for subsidized housing and more affordable housing options, the community members like reject it. And this is a massive problem because there's so much virtue signaling with, but in this house we believe Black Lives Matter signs and protesting all the way last summer and demanding equality and equity. And then when it comes to potentially having just a few units for a few subsidized housing units in, a couple miles away, there's this huge fear that, oh, there's going to be crime, there's going to be vandalism, there's this really awful racial dog whistling going on. And so that mindset really has to change. And this assumption that because somebody doesn't have money necessarily means that there's crime and vandalism is absurd. A friend of mine was telling me that she used to live, when she was in private practice, lived in this like luxury condominium who with like near a bank, and all the like executive and banker bros lived in that condominium. And she said she probably saw cocaine in the elevator on at least a weekly basis, right? But they're not the criminals, right? They're just hardworking people blowing the edge off. And there's constantly vandalism and urinating by these people when they have their drunk nights out. But it's just a completely different conversation. But if like 20 families move in with a government voucher, that's what's going to cause the neighborhood to go downhill. And it's just really disgusting, horrible language. And I'm not necessarily saying I oppose any of the like, cutesy flags or the marching and protesting, but I think there has to be real substantive change behind it. And that's what's severely lacking all over the place. And that's really troubling. And then I think in addition to sort of that coded racism, there's also just the ableism component where we're just okay with people with disabilities just sort of being out of sight and out of mind. And same thing for communities of color, just being out of sight and out of mind. And the idea of like criminalizing panhandlers or criminalizing people who sleep on the streets, it's just terrible. And so another way I look at it is, if you're a privileged older adult, you probably have a home that you own and it's probably relatively safe from foreclosure or natural disasters, or at least have insurance to protect you from natural disasters. And then you also have the options of things beyond nursing homes, like assisted living facilities. There's some assisted living facilities that are effectively like almost luxury hotels, but with aides available. That's an option as well, in addition to living at home, in addition to having family support. Whereas people with disabilities, communities of color just don't have that option. The option is literally anything that has a roof over the head. And again, there's that indignity there, like Lucina was talking about, that it's probably not even enough. They probably almost have to like beg for it. And it's that feeling of take pity, which is just really, really demeaning and awful.
Right, very much the not in my backyard mentality, and very much just stigmatizing substance use disorders in other communities, but not in their own. Not that substance use disorder should ever be stigmatized, it should be treated, but point taken. And for our final question, we have, so emergencies like hurricanes or pandemics frequently shed light on pre-existing inequalities and systemic discrimination, which as someone in a like as all of us in the continuing global pandemic, we've seen, unfortunately, how can we take steps proactively to address those inequalities and respond to those emergencies with a focus on the most marginalized people? And I know that that's another one that can kind of get taken a whole bunch of directions. So if anyone needs a second, that's also completely okay. Valerie, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, environmental racism is another big one, and so I'll talk a little bit more on the infrastructure side. So a lot of those same communities that we disinvest in, that often house communities of color, low-income people, people with disabilities, they are not only under-resourced in housing or in healthcare supports, but the quite literal like infrastructure that builds those neighborhoods. And in some of the work I do, I am able to see a little bit how that is affected these neighborhoods' resilience to climate change. And so, for example, when you live in a neighborhood that does not have a lot of parks or a lot of green space, a lot of trees, then those end up being neighborhoods that get hotter. They flood more. So then you get a heavy rain, you get a lot of snow, you get a hurricane, and then you get a bunch of these homes that flood or get mold damage, which can create, asthma. It's like a long circle or a long lineage of outcomes that keep giving to the communities that live in this neighborhood. In these neighborhoods, we can see, and actually there's maps you can find online that will show, for example, what areas are hottest in the US, and we call them heat islands because of the types of surfaces that are used. And if you map these over like low income areas and areas of color or communities of color, so many places across the United States, they almost perfectly align because we planners and such are aware of these outcomes and these environmental outcomes. And so strategically, these end up in neighborhoods that house people of color. And then these neighborhoods, like for example, we saw with Katrina in the 9th Ward, they get washed out, they get torn down, and some luxury condos go up. And now we have gone back to our last question. We have a bunch of people of color, a bunch of people with disabilities who their houses have been destroyed and new houses they can't afford have been built, and they have no place to go post this disaster, right? And may now have some additional disabilities because of the environmental situations that they've been living in. This kind of decision making is honestly as old as planning. Part of the reason that we started zoning cities in the first place was so that all the gross stuff, right, all the industry and the things that people didn't want to be around wouldn't need to be in our neighborhoods. And then we put the people that we didn't want to be around in those neighborhoods. And we've continued to do this year after year, century after century. And now with the effects of climate change, those same neighborhoods are getting hit the hardest by the effects of climate change. And when that happens, a lot of developers and such have just kind of used that as a way to, okay, well, that was blight we didn't like anyways. So now we'll make something we like here, and we don't really care what happened to the people there.
Right. So both being the root of the problem and then not really fixing it because of the problem that was created in the first place. That sounds like a cycle.
It really is.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, I laugh when I'm just sad, so that's where that's coming from. Lucinda, would you like to take this?
Yeah, so this pandemic it's shed light on a lot of things, but it really shows. So in the Minnesota, last, I think winter, it's been a long 2.5 years, but last winter there's DHS did some research, specifically an organization called Foster Advocates, did some research with other foster care orgs about how did COVID-19 impact foster youth? And we saw that 80% of foster care recipients were negatively impacted by COVID, whether it be the 38%, 30 to 50% that were impacted and lost their housing, whether it be the 40% that were concerned about like health concerns and not having access at that time to the vaccine. But every young person who was in Minnesota at that time was being impacted. And then, but the research itself really honed in on Hennepin County, which is located like within the Twin City and the outside borders of the Twin Cities. And looking at that, we started to see like the amount of the young people who are impacted by that, right? Most of the kids who are in Hennepin County are Black and Native youth. So we're talking about over 80% of your young people who are Black, who are in foster care, have been impacted by COVID. And they're not only are their physical like health at risk, but their emotional health are also at risk. And it took the state of Minnesota almost a year to then give out resources, financial resources to those youth, but they only give it out to 120 young people. And they only give it out to young people who were in this extended foster care, which is at the beginning of this, when I said the 18 to 21-year-old program, right? And it was only for Hennepin County youth. So it wasn't even for all the young people in Hennepin County, but only the small number of folks who were part of programs that were already receiving resources from these programs. So for these young people who did not receive any, who have never received resources from some of these organizations that do really good work, but are being impacted by COVID, you still, too bad, too sad. You fill out the survey, you told us you are at risk of catching COVID, you told us you're at risk of being unhoused. Thank you for telling us, we're gonna put this into our data, but good luck to you, right? And which then you start thinking about like, what are we actually doing to make sure that our young people are protected, and not only in this idea of like protected by, because like when you take a young person out of their home, you as the system now, you are the parent. You have removed them physically from their community and the community that they've known, right? Even if abuse did happen within those in their household, right? Which most foster youth are actually taken out for neglect, and neglect can literally mean a jacket. You didn't have a jacket when you in the wintertime, or it can mean that your parents is dealing with addiction. But you remove that child. Now that child is almost 18 years old. That child may be 20 years old, but you're responsible for that young person. So how are you making sure that young person is being protected? And that sometimes means financially, right? And since then, there has been no other protectors for youth in Minnesota who are in foster care. Since that one, it was like $1,200 given to them, and that was it, right? And the only young people who have been giving any other funding are foster youth who are in college. So it goes back. I always bring this back to the one thing where capitalism and this idea of citizenship, right? You are only giving resources to people who you view are more valuable to your society and deserve and have been working hard enough to get access to resources and get access to money that can literally save their life, right? So now you have it where kids who are receiving the educational training voucher, which is ETV from DHS. So this happened in every state in America, right? If you are a college student who was a foster child, you received extra money. But every other foster youth did not get that opportunity because you're not working hard enough and you're not being productive for our society in this capitalistic world. We don't owe you nothing. And good luck with COVID and good luck finding housing, which I think is just disgusting in itself.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. And then Galila, would you like to close us out?
Sure. Yeah. Excellent points. And I think there's sort of two things that I think about with this question. One is something I already touched base about just access to our long-term services and supports is just so different depending on your privilege and as arbitrary as like what color you were born and what disabilities you have. And it's just, even among people with disabilities, there's still a very, I think, a lot of disparities among, say, some people with IDDs versus someone with like less hidden disabilities. And it's really tragic. And so whether you can access, whether you're forced into the nursing homes or not, or given access to meaningful HCBS, is a huge disparity that we're seeing within disabilities, within people of color with disabilities, and so on. Another thing that I wish received a lot more recognition is regarding something called crisis standards of care, and that's in the broader healthcare space. And that's these medical rationing policies that hospitals and healthcare providers implement if there basically aren't enough ventilators to go around. So that's a huge thing during the pandemic. And so much of what we talk about is about these sort of like below the surface, like a systemic racism kinds of things or systemic discrimination. And what we've been seeing with these crisis standards of care policies is, yes, some of it is based on like systemic discrimination, but a lot of it is just like, no, we're just intentionally being discriminatory. We're intentionally saying the healthier person without disabilities gets the ventilator over somebody with a disability, even though the person with a disability is likely to survive, right? Or the younger person automatically gets the life-saving resource if there's a scarcity over the older person, even if the older person is willing to survive. And then there's a lot of racial undertones there with respect to how certain conditions like renal diseases, failures in the kidneys and diabetes, and some of these conditions that are sort of given you like a negative mark against potentially having life-saving care is so strongly correlated with certain communities of color. And so that's like a very obvious just saying, we're just going to like put it on paper, say these terrible policies. And one easy way to fix that is just to not do that, right? It's just to have stakeholder input from the communities that are impacted or going to be impacted by these policies. We know that political leadership in healthcare and education and government and every aspect of our lives is predominantly white and able-bodied people, right? And so that's why it's important to put people, to have leadership that's representative of our country. But if that isn't happening right away, then the very least people can do is for leaders to get input from those who are impacted by this. And so the fact that hospitals are putting out these policies without reaching out to disability rights groups and health equity groups and other people was really disappointing. And again, it's something that the pandemic was one of the few times when the blatant discrimination is like written out in black and white with no apology, no way of remedying or modifying those words. And so it's been pretty terrible. But luckily there's more and more pressure to say, at the very least, make sure people are brought to the table in some way or form when you're enacting these policies. And I think that's really important for us to stress moving forward.
Absolutely. And if anyone currently watching this is looking for resources to learn about what crisis standards of care look like in your state and what resources there are around advocacy for that, we do have that available on the ASAN website right under our COVID-19 resources. So feel free to check that out. All right, so that's the last question that we have. Thank you so much to all of our panelists, and thank you so much to all of our attendees for participating. And our next event will be coming up shortly. Please do refer back to your Gala programs to see the time that the next stream is going up. All right, thank you so much and have a great rest of your night. Bye, everyone. Thank you.